Well, the piece of First Peter that we're looking at really gets into this issue of love, and that you know that you're a Christian, you know that you're becoming holy, not just because of your relationship with God, very important, key, integral, priority, but with your relationship with people. Not just the people that are close to you, not just the people you love, not just your friends, not just your family, but also the people that are around your life that you would almost like to not be around your life, okay? So love is for all, and if you're a follower of Christ, not only should you be growing in your relationship with God, you should be growing in your relationship with people. Specifically, as 1 Peter is showing us, the people who are hostile to you. Now, this is a work of God. This is something God must do, but it is a part of the gospel. And so he gets into this at the end of chapter 1, that we are to literally love each other strenuously. It's a word that's used for distance runners, that we are to go the extra mile with people. We are to push through the pain, push through the cramps, push through, the lack of air, and really love people well. And he gets into chapter 2 and he says, this is what keeps you from loving people well. This is what keeps you from experiencing the kind of love relationships that I have. One is, chapter 2, verse 1, malice. Malice is when we go after people directly, right? And we kind of are out to get them directly with our actions. Slander, which is mentioned in chapter 2, verse 1, is when we go after people indirectly with our words. I actually have respect for people who come at me with malice more than respect for people who come at me with slander, because at least the people with malice have courage, right? They come and tell me exactly what they think versus going behind my back, talking about me, maligning my character. But both are examples of a lack of love. Chapter 2, verse 1 also mentions this idea of deceit. This is what keeps us from loving people. Deceit. This is the word for bait, when you hide the hook. When you are dealing with people, you're really not telling them the whole truth, or you're withholding part of it. You're kind of talking around issues. You're being passive-aggressive. And if you're doing that, that's keeping you from loving that person, and quite frankly, keeping that person from loving you. Hypocrisy is another issue, chapter 2, verse 1. This is the word for play acting, where you're literally playing a role. You're not who you really are. You're putting an image forth. You're putting an image forth of whatever the situation calls for, so that you can maximize your experience in that situation. You're acting like a person, depending on what situation you're in, so that you can be most benefited. So you're putting a mask on and being one person here, one person there. You're a chameleon, so that people will basically give you what you want, right? Envy. Envy is when we want other people's stuff, or we want other people's life more than we want them. And so all of these things produce a lack of love. And so Peter kind of hammers on us, and this is what we dealt with last week. I'm kind of re-preaching the sermon. But it's not just all the negative. He's not just kind of leaving us hanging with, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. He's saying, let me tell you about how to love. Let me tell you about what church is supposed to be like, because if you don't experience what church is supposed to be like, you're going to be in real trouble when you deal with the government, which is where we're going. You're going to be in real trouble when you deal with persecution, when you deal with people who have authority that are not exactly excited about your faith and your values. So how do you become the church, and what does that look like with relationship to the government? That's where we're going. That's what we're dealing with. And he does tell us something interesting about the church, and we'll do one little bit review there in verse 5. We'll go back to chapter 2, verse 5 with me. Chapter 2, verse 5, that's over on page 1014. Peter writes to the church, you yourselves, the church, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You are like living stones. He's talking to the church. And what he's saying is this: you individually are part of a corporate thing. That is the church. This is what a spiritual house is. This is what a temple is. This is what the church is. Church is not bricks and mortar. Church is not an event. The church literally are people being built together, like a brick. If you've ever looked, had brick in your home or looked at a brick wall, you know that if one brick is missing, there's trouble. Every brick on a wall is necessary. The bricks above you, you're the brick. Did you get that metaphor? You're the living stone. You're the brick, I'm the brick. So if the bricks above us, we're in the wall, the bricks above us need us, and we need the bricks below us. And Peter is saying, this is the church. You are integral. You are needed. This is not the way most people do church, though. This is not the way most people think about church and their relationship with God. Most people think about church simply, they're a bunch of individuals. So it really doesn't matter what others do. That doesn't really affect them. It doesn't matter what they do, because that doesn't really affect other people. Peter begs to differ. He says it does matter. Now get the wisdom of this metaphor he's using, this construction metaphor. Essentially what he's saying is this. You're like a living stone. I think he would ask us per this metaphor, are you so fitted into the lives of other people that if you were hit by a bus, morbid thought, I know, but if you were hit by a bus, would something collapse? That if you weren't around, some people's lives would be dramatically affected. Some people's lives would almost fall apart if you weren't around. Peter says, that's the church. That's what I'm talking about when I say church. The church is to be a place of interdependence, not independence, where we struggle together, where we suffer together, where when we have hard decisions, we counsel each other about it. When we have needs, we help meet those needs. That, when the New Testament says church, that's what it's saying when it says church. And see, what Peter says later in verse 5 is, this is what produces spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God. What he's saying is, this is what worship is. Worship is not just singing songs. Worship is when the church is the church, when the church is interdependent upon each other. We say, well, I have my private time with God. I really enjoy the outdoors. I worship at the lake. I hope you do. That's good. But don't call that church. You say, well, that's my definition of church. I understand that's not the Bible's definition, though. And see, what we do, and this is a product of who we are as a nation and kind of Western individualism in general, is we totally take the church, we make it individualistic. Everyone has their personal relationship with Jesus. They have their personal, big evangelical buzzword, quiet time. We spend time with God. Sometimes those times are more quiet than others, right? But we do this every day. We meet with God. And then that is kind of what we think of our experience. We don't consider the fact that when the Bible talks about church, when the Bible talks about obedience, a ton of things that it commands in the New Testament cannot be obeyed if you're not connected in the church. For instance, Galatians, it says, we are to restore one another. The word restore means to mend the nets. When fishermen's nets would break, their buddies, their partners would come and mend the nets. We are to do that for one another. So if people are broken in the church, it's not the pastor's responsibility to make sure they're fixed. It's yours. We restore one another. We bear one another's burdens. There are people in this room right now, listening on the video, watching on the video, that are absolutely in a mess. If someone doesn't bear their burden, it's going to crush them. Right? We bear each other's burdens. You get into the book of Romans, and it says we are to contribute to the needs of the saints. Meaning, someone has a financial problem. Who deals with that? Well, the church does. We have a huge benevolence ministry, especially with all that's going on in our economy. But the truth is, yes, the church should have a formal policy and program for that. But really, the members of the church, when they find out about needs, should meet them. That's what the book of Romans says. The book of Romans says we should show hospitality, meaning you should have people in your house from the church. When's the last time that happened? Right? This is what the church is. This is what the church is. In James, we're told to pray for one another, to the point that you actually are comfortable enough to confess your sins to one another. Can you imagine being so connected to people that you don't have to hide what's really going on in your life, that you actually are able to tell your secrets? That's the church. That's the church. In the book of Ephesians, it says that we are to speak truth to one another in love. That's the church. Now, this is not the way we looked at church, and this hit me in the face when we moved here, because my wife and I moved to plant the Journey. It'll be, I think, 8 years in July. Is that right? 8 years? Yes. Time goes by fast. The church will be 7 years old in September, but we moved 8 years ago in July, and we started meeting in our basement, which was kind of weird. But we didn't have any money, and we didn't have any people, so basement seemed well and good enough for us. So we started gathering people, and I remember one of the guys that came during the basement, months. I was talking to him after our little worship service in our basement, and I said, "Hey, are you in? You gonna help us? We got a big vision. We need you." And he was like, "Yeah, you know what? This is great." We met on Sunday nights. He goes, "This will be great for my Sunday night." And I said, "Well, what do you mean Sunday night?" He goes, "Well, I like to go hear so-and-so preach on Sunday morning, and then I do BSF on Tuesday night." It was Bible Study Fellowship, this thing that happens in St. Louis and beyond. And then I've got the singles group that meets on Thursday nights. And then on Wednesday nights, I go here. And then there's this really cool church called Family Church. And they have this really cool worship service with Rams players on Friday night. So I'm going to go there on Friday night. And then you're going to be my Sunday night. And I said to him, "No, we're not. That's not what we're doing, bro. We're not here to fill up your Christian social calendar." Because here's what this guy was doing, and this is what a lot of people do. He was consuming everywhere, serving nowhere. That's not the church. That's American Christianity, but that's not biblical Christianity. And this guy knew better. It wasn't like he had these huge needs in his life and he was needing truth and he was needing relationship. He was simply being a Christian consumer. He didn't understand community. Now, the best way I can articulate how this works and how you're needed is through a story. I've been studying this group called the Inklings. Have you heard of these guys? They do not exist anymore. They're all dead. But they still live. Because you've probably seen movies based on their readings, and many of you have read their writings directly. Here's who the Inklings were: C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, and Ronald Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien. Lewis called him Ronald. And what happened was they'd meet, I think it was Tuesday or Thursday, I should know since I studied them, read a few books this year, Tuesday or Thursday, and they would write stuff during the week, and then they would kind of critique each other. They would read. If you're a writer, you know how valuable this is to have other people critique you and how painful it is. But they would do that, and they would just hang out, just together, and they were just committed to each other for years. Well, Charles died, and C.S. Lewis wasn't excited about Charles dying, but he thought, you know what, I'm going to get more of Ronald now, of Tolkien. You know that guy, Lord of the Rings guy, Tolkien? I'm going to get more of Ronald now because Charles is dead. And Lewis was surprised at actually what happens. Let me read what he says. He said, "In each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can bring fully out. By myself, I am not large enough to call any person into complete activity." In other words, to let their personality really be brought out. Now that Charles is dead, I never, ever see Tolkien's reaction to any specifically Charles joke. Far from having more of Tolkien, far from having him more to myself, now that Charles is gone, I have less of him. Charles brought out something in Tolkien that I cannot bring out, and now that Charles is gone, we're missing something. He didn't gain more of Tolkien by losing Williams. He lost some of Tolkien because Charles wasn't there to bring out more of Tolkien. Here's what I'm saying. It takes a community to bring out all of who you are. It just does. You've probably seen it, and you're having a conversation with somebody, and somebody else comes in, and suddenly it kind of takes it up a notch, right? There's something about community that brings out the best of who we are. And in a sense, you only maximize yourself by being in community. Community brings out our full potential personally, and I think the Bible's saying it does that spiritually. But by choosing to be, which a lot of us are trying to do this, trying to be spiritual apart from community, here's what you do. You short-circuit your own spiritual growth, and you shortchange the people around you who would benefit from you in community. I remember the church that I was at before I moved to St. Louis. I helped start a church when I was in seminary. I was the youngest guy on staff by like 10 years. And my pastor was an ex-software engineer guy. He liked graphs, he liked charts, and he liked meetings. I hated, in this order, graphs, charts, and meetings. And so we're always in meetings. I'm just hating my life. Every time we're at a meeting, this was before you could like surf the internet on your cell phone. And so I would be in these meetings ready, praying for the rapture, praying for my untimely death, anything to get out of the meeting, fire alarm, anything to not have to do yet another meeting. And I remember the meeting was dismissed. He said, "Hey, Darren, I want to talk to you." And this is like the fourth time this happened, so I knew what was coming. And he was like, "Hey, man," and what I thought he was going to say is, "You know what? You're a young guy and you want to go plant a church. Don't you think maybe you have something to learn from these meetings? Don't you think you need this?" I thought that's what he was going to say. You know what he said? He said, "Darren, when you don't participate well in our meeting, something's missing. We need you. We need you engaged. We need you active. In fact, if you don't participate, this church is in trouble." Guys, your church needs you. It needs your voice. It needs your gifts. It needs your impact. In fact, I would dare say it this way. The Bible backing me up here. We're in trouble without you. We're in trouble. Because every stone, every brick matters. See, most people don't go far enough with community, and it's because of our American individualism. Some of us, though, and some people, go too far with community. The Greek word for fellowship or community is the word koinonia. And one author noticed that some Christians have koinonitis, right? They're so addicted to community within the Christian community that it's really too much. I remember doing a consulting thing for a denomination. I was in a large city, I'll say it that way, and in desperate need of many churches, millions and millions and millions and millions of people in this city. And I found myself shocked to be in this meeting because I'm sitting there trying to convince these denominational leaders that their churches needed to grow to reach their city. I couldn't believe it. And because as I began to talk to them and some of their pastors, they're like, well, if we do that, we'll upset people. Well, if we do that, that'll mess up kind of what we have. And my point was, exactly. You're getting killed, right? Your churches are small while your city is growing. Nothing wrong with a small church, but man, we ought at least be trying to grow with new people who need to know Christ. And so I was shocked because what they had essentially done is they had made their mission community. The mission of their church is to become community. They were totally missing the import of the Bible. The Bible says that really what it's about from the beginning is we're a community on mission starting with God. Not a mission of community, community on mission. God was the first community. He was the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, eternal community, have been together forever. And when men and women sinned against God, Genesis chapter 3, verse 9, the first missionary kicks in. Who was it? God. He looks at Adam and says, "Where are you?" And God begins his pursuit of lost humanity. He's a community on mission. Adam and Eve, he creates them. His original cultural mandate was, I want you to fill the earth and subdue it. I want you to develop a God-glorifying culture, rule over creation in my name. You're a community, you're a family, be on mission. Genesis chapter 12, he goes to Abraham and he says, Abraham, things are really screwed up. It's bad. It's getting worse. I'm going to start over with a family. And this family is going to be a community on mission. And that's what the nation of Israel was supposed to be. A light to the Gentiles, a picture of how God works with a nation. Community on mission. You get into the New Testament, it's the church. The church is part of this great movement of God, a community on mission, where the Father sent the Son sent the Spirit, and the Spirit sends the church. We're a sent people. So it is about community, but it's not only about community. It's a community that is on mission. And when the community is on mission, you will have tension. And this is why churches don't do it. And this is why people in churches don't do it. Because it's tension. It's painful. It's a paradox. What do you mean, Darren? Well, because we're like the world in some respects, but we're not like the world. We're in the world, but we're not supposed to be of the world. We are literally against the world in some ways, but in other ways we're for the world. And this is not a problem we can solve. It is a tension that we have to manage. And most Christians and most churches dare not live in that tension. And so they choose one ditch or the other. One ditch that the church tends to choose and people choose is fundamentalism. Now, when I say fundamentalism, I do not mean people who believe the fundamentals of the Bible. That's not what I'm saying. Let me define it this way. These are people who say we should separate from culture completely. The people on the outside are the enemies. The bad guys, we're the good guys. Us versus them. Very high standards to join. Very exclusive, right? Fundamentalistic people say we're always right, others are mostly always wrong. We're pure, you're defiled. We have insight, you're deceived. Right? And so to avoid tension, some people go into that ditch. Others go into the relativistic ditch. Instead of being separate from culture here, you're just the same as culture. You can't really tell the difference between, the people in the church and the people outside the church. People on the outside are all friends. We're all kind of the same. It doesn't really matter what you believe. Us, is them. It's not us and them. We are them. They're just like us. Low standards. Anyone can join, right? But there is a little bit of self-righteousness in relativistic people because they say things like this. Well, we're rational. We're thoughtful. And if you don't agree with us, you're irrational. We're progressive. You're regressive. We're open-minded. You're intolerant. And what I find so interesting about both sides of these ditch that the church tends to go into is both of these extremes, in a real sense, avoid suffering, which is what the book of 1 Peter is all about, and the tension that Peter's going to put us in just a second. See, if you're a fundamentalist, here's how you avoid suffering. Because it's us versus them, and you have this thing, if I touch messy people, I will contaminate myself. So I will avoid messy people. And so when you do that, when you just hang around your people who think like you, smell like you, act like you, and that's who your sphere is, and your kids never encounter anyone with a little bit different worldview or a little bit different attitude about certain things, when your whole life is built that way, then everything is black and white, and you don't ever have to deal with gray, and you love that. Because everything's certain, and everything's controlled, and everything's measured. Right? But you avoid suffering because you don't mess with really messy people. Now, on the other hand, if you're a relativist, here's what happens. Because you never take a stand against culture, because you're always going with the flow, going with the current, going with the stream, you live in gray, and you never have to deal with black and white, which means your character, your behavior is never criticized. You're your own God. And here's what Peter's doing to the church. He's saying, don't fall in those ditches. I want to put you right in the tension that is supposed to be the church. Look in verse 11. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against the soul. I want to really focus on this idea of sojourners and exiles. The word literally means aliens. That we're here, but we're not a part of what is happening. We're different. We don't fit the labels. Let me give you some things. I got this from Tim Keller in one of his sermons about early Christians. and what they stood for and their behavior. Get ready to be offended, all of you. Okay? Just warning you. This is an equal opportunity offensive deal. This is what the early Christians, this is history, okay? So you check it out for yourself. But this is how they behaved. They did not serve in the military and participate in Caesar's wars of conquest. Because basically he's trying to take over the whole known world, oppressing people, invading countries for no reason other than just to, build the kingdom. And so they wouldn't do it. So the people around them said, you're unpatriotic. They didn't go to the gladiator events. Okay, you guys have all seen Gladiator, right? Russell Crowe, right? Where you're killing people for sport, basically. Thumbs up, thumbs down, that whole deal. They didn't go to that, so they were considered antisocial, because that was like going to, the Cardinals game, right? But they wouldn't go. They wouldn't go, right? They didn't support the killing of infants, because what would happen is women were so devalued in this culture, when they would have babies, and they didn't have ultrasounds back then, so they didn't know until the baby was born. If the baby was a girl, here's what they would do. They would take the baby many times and just sit it outside and let it be exposed to the elements and die. And the Christians, not only did they not participate in that, they would adopt these little baby girls. And so in doing so, they were considered kind of anti-family, because they're messing with the family order, how things are done. You're making these families feel bad by adopting these little girls. They believed that women were equal with men. And so the early church had women in leadership. You can go back and study. Women were deacons and scripture readers and worship leaders in the early church. And this messed up the societal, the whole societal order, because essentially there was an order to family, and men were in charge and women were subjugated, and it just messed with all that. The early Christians were against sex outside of marriage, which just made them unprogressive. They were committed to serving and empowering the poor, which made them anti-societal, because this just jacked up all the class systems. Because people who weren't poor were serving the poor, and it just messed everything up. And they said Jesus is the only way to salvation. Slightly controversial in a pluralistic world. They were actually called, this is where I think the term atheist came in, because the Christians did not believe in all the plurality of gods. They were atheistic about all the other gods. This made them aliens, strangers, exiles, sojourners in the Greco-Roman world. Now, let's go to the 21st century, as in like right now. In our culture, what do you call people who are against war, but also against sex outside of marriage? What do you call people who are against killing babies, but committed to empowering the poor? What do you call people who are for human rights, specifically women's rights, but demand and insist that Jesus is the way to God? What do you call people in our culture with the beliefs and practices like that? You know what you call them? They're in trouble. That's what you call them. Because they're shot from every side. They don't fit the nice little categories that we put: conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. It doesn't fit. Aliens, strangers, sojourners. See, this idea of sojourners and exiles, it doesn't mean like they're an alien, like they're temporary, like they're snowbirds coming down when the weather gets cold where they're from and they come down to the... That's not what he's saying. He's not a tourist. You're literally, the word means resident alien. So you're from another place. You're not really from the place, but you're there as a resident. You're setting up shop. They were permanent visitors. This is what God has called us to be. They didn't lose their beliefs and assimilate into the world. They didn't create a subculture and hide from the world. And so Peter's saying, don't do that. Don't assimilate. Don't create a subculture. Literally imitate what happened in the Old Testament to God's people. God's people were taken captive. It's actually because of the judgment of God, because of God's people's unfaithfulness. He let another nation come in and literally kidnap them, take them out of their country into Babylon. And at Babylon, God's people were there, and there were two temptations, two ditches. It's going to sound familiar. The Babylonians said, just assimilate. Just come into our culture, do pagan worship. You remember the book of Daniel. Daniel's name was changed to Belshazzar, right? Just assimilate, just eat our food, do our customs, just kind of lose your cultural identity, just assimilate, drink the Kool-Aid, just come on in, assimilate, give a big group hug to all of our cultural stuff. Because the Babylonians knew if God's people did that, they would lose all their distinctives. So that was one ditch. The other ditch was the false prophets who rose up in Jeremiah chapter 28 and said, hey, I know you're in captivity, and some guys are saying we're going to be here 70 years. We're only going to be here a couple years. So just kind of hang out in the city, but not too much. Kind of use the city when you need it, but don't really talk to people. Kind of come in and use it for food and entertainment and kind of do whatever, but then get out as fast as you can. Don't engage. And what Jeremiah said, God through Jeremiah, is this to God's people: build houses and live in them. Don't build them to flip them. Live in them. Plant gardens. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Have kids. Seek the welfare of the city, the shalom. Be there for the city. Don't use the city. Don't be abused by the city, but live there. Be distinct, but be engaged. It's the same thing. And if you're a Christian, you are in constant tension here, because at times you're going to be persecuted from the culture, and at times you're going to be lauded by the culture because you're for the city. And let me just say it this way. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not living in this tension. If at times you're like, oh, I don't know if I should do that, or should I do that, or I don't know if I should. If there's not a disconnect sometimes between I'm trying to be faithful to God, but I'm trying to engage with people, you are not in the tension. You're not there. Because when you're there, standing for the truth, trying to engage the culture, sometimes because you're not Jesus, which is helpful to remind yourself of, sometimes you will go too far, other times you will not go far enough. And that is the tension. Now, why do you talk like this? I mean, is this really, this is exactly what Peter's saying. And he's giving us kind of the result of when we live in that tension, when we are resident aliens. Look in verse 12. 1 Peter 2:12. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. Gentiles is kind of code word for people outside the community of faith. So that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be holy in your behavior. Keep your behavior excellent. And if you do that, nobody will criticize you. Is that what it says? No. If you keep your conduct holy, they're already doing it. So that when they speak, they're already going to speak against you. Sometimes because they think you're self-righteous. Sometimes because they think you're not being authentic, you're a hypocrite. Other times because your righteous behavior convicts them of their unrighteous behavior. They will speak against you. But don't let that discourage you. Do good deeds. Do good works. Let your good deeds be a demonstration that God is real, so that one day maybe they will glorify God. See, these good deeds aren't just religious deeds. They're deeds of service. They're deeds of service. Peter is saying, what if, church, let me give you a picture. What if you didn't just attack the culture all the time? Put out newsletters and blog about everything that's wrong. What if you didn't do that? What if you just didn't attack things all the time? What if, though, you didn't just assimilate and go with the stream? What if you lived in that tension? What if you absolutely stood rock solid about what you believed without a shred of self-righteousness? What if you absolutely held to your distinct counter-cultural views, but you spoke kindly to those with whom you disagree? What if you insisted on truth, that truth is real and it can be known, and that truth is a person? What if you insisted on truth, but you also insisted that the marginalized peoples of the community were well served? What if you could be that? What would happen? Well, you would still be rejected. They would still talk about you. But you would be respected. You will still be persecuted, but at times you'll be praised. You will still be slandered, but they will also salute you. See, it's this crazy thing that happens when the church serves the city well. See, here's what it is. It's common grace. Common grace. You should Google it and study it. Common grace. Wikipedia has a tremendous definition. I looked it up yesterday. Here's what common grace is as applied to what I'm saying. Human beings are so made in God's image that even those, and that's everybody, that's not just Christians, everybody's made in God's image. So we are so made in God's image that even the people who do not share our values know the truth when they see it lived out. They cannot not like it. There's something in them that says, I don't believe anything these people say, but that is right. There's something there, right? Stand for the truth, serve in love. Now, this is hard. This is why it's not done. And people click over to one side or the other. They fall in one ditch or the other. This is tough stuff. This is not easy with people. But it gets worse. Because look at what Peter does to us in verse 13. Be subject or submit for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Did he say every? Whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Verse 15. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Now I need to pull in a passage from Paul to really drill down here. So this is Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Paul writes in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Very similar to what Peter said. For there is no authority except from who? God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Okay, so God puts authority over our lives. What is authority? Let me give you a definition. Authority is the people and institutions that God puts over us to teach, protect, and correct us. Parents, which is why when you're a child you're told to obey your parents. Church leaders, there's a submission to church leadership. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 7. And then there's the government. And throughout, when God talks about authorities on this level, God always gives a one-word response to what we are to do with authority. And that word is submit. Submit. Well, that makes total sense, Darren. Submit. Okay, so the word submit means to place yourself under authority. Authority's over you, you put yourself under it in your rightful place. You assume the right order. That totally makes sense if my party is in charge in the White House. I get that. Wait a minute, though. Look at who he tells to submit. Look at verse 18. Servants, slaves, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. Now, slavery in the Bible, as we've talked about many times, is not slavery like in our nation. It wasn't chattel slavery. It wasn't lifelong. It wasn't race-based. It was usually because of debt. But even in debt, even in that situation, God says, servants, submit. Christian servants, submit. Submit by to the government now, going back there, verse 15. How do we submit? What does it look like to submit? He says submit in verse 13, in verse 14. But then he says in verses 16, verse 15, you submit by doing good. There's that word again, good deeds. Deeds of service. And don't use your freedom from the government. In other words, you're a Christian. Caesar's not Lord. Jesus is Lord. Everybody else said Caesar. No, Jesus is Lord. So you're free from the government. That's not your master. That's not your Lord. So you're free. However, do not use your freedom as an excuse to be evil to the evil government. We having fun yet? What do you mean evil? He told us in chapter 2, verse 1, malice. Were we directly, with our actions, do not submit to God's authority in government. Slander, when we speak against those who are in authority. Rather, he says, you need to honor them. You need to submit to them, but you need to honor. Now, this is the way, I'll tease it a little bit. This is what I think he's saying in the passage. This is the wisdom of this passage. When people who vehemently disagree with what the government is doing, when Christ followers vehemently disagree with what the government is doing, but they disagree with honor, Christ is honored. When people who vehemently disagree with what the government is doing and disagree with dishonor, Christ is dishonored. Look in verse 17. Honor most people. Honor my political party people. What's it say? Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. And I love it because Peter's like, you're going to try to squirm out of this one. Honor the emperor. He says it twice. Honor everyone. Fear God. Love the brotherhood. Honor the emperor. Who was the emperor? Nero. What was he doing to Christians? What did he do to Christians? He burned out a city, blamed the Christians. He literally used Christians, as we'll get to in chapter 4, they would impale Christians on a pole, put up some kind of flammable chemical on them and set them on fire, and they would be the torches in the fields for the parties that were basically orgies. That's who Peter says honor. The word honor means to esteem, to reverence, it comes to the word that means to fix a price and then stick to it no matter what. So you've assigned a value to something and you've said, no matter what they do, no matter what changes in the economy, or no matter what happens in the market, that is my price. That is my level. And so I'm going to honor them at this level no matter what happens. Now, let me give you a picture real quick, because honor seems easy until it gets specific. Okay, so first picture we'll show you is our buddy Nero. This is Nero, or the artist's best rendering of Nero. Okay. Now, you might remember this guy. Next one. Remember President Clinton? Okay. And then you might remember this guy, the next president that served our country. Just going to let that one sit a second. You might remember the next, our current president. Now, I would love to have had some kind of diagnostic medical tool to measure the heart rate of you folks when these pictures came up. When your heart began to race, feel the blood coming to your neck just at the thought of who, that's the one you should honor. That's the one you should honor. They don't deserve honor. They're wicked, they're sinful, their policies are atrocious, their lifestyle is ungodly, they're liars, they're hypocrites. Honor everyone. Honor the emperor who was killing people, and it was endorsed. It was just normal. Let me tell you what honor doesn't mean. Honor does not mean you don't work to reverse unjust laws. You do it with respect. You do it with proper litigation. You do it with, you do it shrewdly. You do it non-violently. Okay? So I'm not saying you don't. That's the beauty of our country. We get to do that. Not every country gets to do that. You realize that, right? We get to do that. So that's perfectly acceptable. I would encourage respect when you're doing it. That's not a law. Right? It's God's law, but it's not our nation's law. Honor does not mean you obey authority when they tell you to disobey God. So if the government or some authority in your life tells you you must disobey God, you can say no. That's not. You don't have to submit to that. I would add that you would need to be honorable and respectful as you do that. But what does it mean to honor? I think our text tells us. Verse 17. All these are imperatives. And it's like he's just giving these little punchlines. In verse 17, he says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God. Let's start with fear God. What he's saying is, you need to fear God, not the oppressors. The opposite of fear is trust. So what he's saying is, trust God, not the government. Get your security from God, not the laws of the government. You may get the laws changed, and that's great until the next president comes in, right? Or the next administration, and then all your laws get messed up, right? So don't trust that. Trust God. Fear God, not your oppressor. And then love the brotherhood. This is community. Love the church. Be committed to the church, emotionally connected to the church. Get your security from the church, not from the government. Be a community on mission. If the church was a community on mission, our world would be a lot less screwed up, because when we let the government do things that the church is supposed to do, it's out of order. It doesn't work. Everything gets messed up. So love the church. Be a part of the church. Love the brotherhood. So Darren, okay, now wait. Are you telling me to honor the dishonorable? Are you telling me to honor that which is evil? No, I'm not saying that. The Bible is saying that. I read the Bible to you. And this is exactly what Jesus did. Look in verse 21. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you may follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. He feared God, not the oppressors. Here's reality, and this is what's painful, and this is what's hard. But this is reality. You and I have been called to suffer at the hands of our governing authorities. It's our calling. Why? Because no government is perfect, and no government follows God's law perfectly. And when authority doesn't follow God's law perfectly, the people in submission to that law and to that authority suffer. You've been called to suffer because of governing authorities. And because Jesus did it, you can submit without sinning. You can submit. I'm not saying you'll like it. Some of you you're counting the cost. You know exactly what this looks like for you. And then you're gritting your teeth. I'm not saying you're going to like it, but you can submit to something you don't agree with and honor the authority without sinning. You can be like Jesus and love your enemies. You can follow Jesus' example. But let me tell you something. You really can't follow Jesus' example, which is why he ends with these two verses. This is very important. This is the punchline, verse 24. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Why does he do that? Who is he talking to? Remember. These are people being persecuted, some of them getting ready to be executed. And he's sitting there telling them about their sin? Is that compassionate? What does he think he's doing? How can you bring it back and then talk about how deal with the government, Peter? You know what? Let's deal with that. That's the problem. Peter says that's not the problem. Church, you're the problem. Here's what I think he's saying. By ending this way in context, church, you need to focus more on your sin than the government's sin. I'm not saying you don't focus on the government's sin. I'm not saying you don't work for justice. That you don't take up issues of sanctity of life and issues of gender and all those kind of things. I'm not saying you don't, but worry more about your sin so that when you deal with the government's sin, you do it with a broken heart instead of a self-righteous heart. So that the people looking in can't pigeonhole you and discount the gospel because of your crappy attitude. So you focus on your sin. Focus on your need to be saved more than the government's need to be saved. Because the solution to the problems in our world, friends, is not a better government. It's a better church. Now, you got a Bible, and you can study for yourself. This is my take on this passage. And I like it because everyone's offended. And I think we need to be. One of the blessings and curses of our country is our ability to participate and voice our concerns with regard to how we're governed. It's a blessing and it's a curse because we tend to be more political than we are Christian sometimes. And I'm challenging you to love the church and to love the community being on mission more than you love politics. If we change politics without changing hearts, it doesn't work. We've seen it. It doesn't work. Changed hearts change the world. Only the church does that. And we get to be the church. Let's pray together. Lord, I pray that those of us who are involved on the front lines of the political process would not step off, that they would go out empowered, emboldened, but humble. That they would have the humble confidence that only the gospel can bring. That we would seek to love our city and love our country and love this world better. That we would work for justice where there is injustice. But God, I pray that for those of my friends who need to repent because they think that if the White House can change, or if the Congress can change, or if this law can be passed, that everything's going to be fixed. God, would you show them that is not reality? Would you show them that the reality and the work needs to be done on the heart level, that as living stones are built together, lives are changed one person at a time, and the church can be on mission. And Jesus, it was your plan A. You said it's the church that storms the gates of hell. It's the church that defeats evil. And we know it's not because of how good we are, but because of how good Jesus is. So God, help us to be the church. And I pray for my friends on both sides of the divide, God, that we would be a church that offends everyone, because we cannot be labeled and we cannot be boxed in. That we confound the categories, not because we want to be controversial, but because we want to be Jesus. We want to be like him, who critique conservatives and liberals, who loved the poor, and yet built a massive organization called the church. And it's more organism than organization. And God, that's what we want to be. We want to be a living community that loves our city, and we need your power. So help us, Lord. Friends, take a minute, process what God's saying to you, and we'll respond corporately in just a moment.